Let me introduce you to Scott Pappalardo. As of the recording of this video, ABC News launched this video on Facebook about 19 hours ago, and it's already acquired 3.7 million views and over 64,000 likes. Guys, this is super viral. ABC's caption under the video reads, "One less. Scott Pappalardo owned his AR-15 rifle for more than 30 years. He even has a Second Amendment tattoo on his arm. This weekend, he destroyed his gun, quote, to make sure this weapon will never be able to take a life." As you can imagine, there are a lot of people condemning this guy and a lot of people commending him. Now, I don't know if this guy's being sincere, and I don't know if he's a shield being paid to do this, but it really doesn't matter. One thing that does matter that we can objectively determine is that his rhetoric matches the emotionally charged agenda being pushed by mainstream media to demonize weapons, particularly the scary black AR-15. This same rhetoric is also being used to take freedoms from the rest of us because, well, the dead children. What he says is important to consider because his sentiments reflect the mindset of a large portion of our society. I'm going to cover the segments of his longer 6-minute video. ABC only posted a condensed 2-minute version. So let's get started.
My name is Scott Pappalardo, and this is my pre-ban, legally registered AR-15, which I purchased over 30 years ago. Now, I'm a firm believer in the Second Amendment, and I even have it tattooed on my arm.
Now, let me remind you guys what the Second Amendment to the Constitution actually says. Quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." I run into people all the time who say, "I got a right to have a weapon because of the Second Amendment." This would be wrong thinking. What if they modified this amendment or changed it to read, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms if the authorities allow it"? If your right depends on one sentence on one piece of paper and you pin your hopes on that sentence, then to be consistent, you would have to stand by that amendment if it ever was modified. And amendments can be modified. That's why they're called amendments. But the good news is your right to defend yourself and your family by any means does not come from a fancy piece of paper written over 200 years ago by a bunch of guys who have long since died. Your right to defend yourself comes from the self-evident fact that you are a human being. If someone attacks you, you have the right to use deadly force, and you have the right to acquire the weapons that you're going to use to protect yourself. But let's just take Scott Pappalardo for what he says and let's hold him to it.
I'm a firm believer in the Second Amendment.
So, he's a firm believer in the Second Amendment. Let's see if that's true, because as it stands right now, shall not be infringed means exactly that. This language cannot be more clear. Let's see if we can discover any signs that Scott is willing to let that tattooed Second Amendment right be infringed.
Now, a lot of people have said to me, well, what do you need to own a weapon like that for? Its only purpose is to kill.
Now, Scott goes on to say how much fun he has shooting this weapon, but he doesn't deal with this statement where a lot of people have said to him that its only purpose is to kill. First of all, that's just not true. You can use it for target practice, and its mere presence can actually discourage crime. Ever heard of the phrase, "an armed society is a polite society"? Not to mention, not all killing is bad. If someone was in the process of raping my daughter, or your daughter for that matter, I would have no problem pulling the trigger of an AR-15 and personally revoking that scumbag's right to life card. That would be a justified and good killing. Then Scott says,
And I remember after Sandy Hook happened, I said to my wife, I'd gladly give this gun up if it would save the life of just one child.
Now, this sounds noble and virtuous, but it's utter nonsense. How in God's name would a responsible gun owner giving up his weapon save a child's life? We'll talk more about this in a minute.
That's 5 years ago now. And since then, over 400 people have been shot in over 200 school shootings. So I guess my words were just empty words in the spur of the moment. And now, here we are, 17 more lives lost. So when do we change? When do we make laws that say maybe a weapon like this isn't acceptable in today's society.
Now think about this for a second rationally. A law is nothing more than the opinion and command of a group of politicians backed by the threat of force. Transgressing that law makes the lawbreaker a criminal in the eyes of the state. As an example of how ridiculous this can be, at 11:59 p.m. on the night of April 30th, 1933, if you owned gold, you were fine. But when the clock struck 12 in the morning on May 1st, this new law declared you a criminal merely because some politicians said so. You didn't commit a crime, you were just declared a criminal. Now, if after this date you were still found to be holding gold, men with guns would come to your house, fine you, and throw you into a cage. What Scott is proposing here is that a new anti-gun law is enacted. Now here's the insanity part. This anti-gun law is going to be enforced by a man or group of men with guns. And if history is any indicator, a SWAT team could realistically come to your house, each man outfitted with an AR-15, so they can come and take away your AR-15. This is literal insanity. So anti-gunners who want to get these laws passed are actually advocating gun violence so that they can stop gun violence. To break this down, if you currently own an AR-15 and they ban them and declare them illegal, the state makes you a criminal. These anti-gun, anti-AR-15 people who are protesting all over the nation and laying down in front of the White House are literally begging the government to make you a criminal, and they want the state to force you to give up your guns at gunpoint. They're demanding that you become the victim of state-sponsored gun violence in order to get rid of gun violence in our society. Can there be anything more hypocritical or retarded?
And there's a lot of blame people can put on the desensitizing with video games and the internet, bad parenting, mental illness, but ultimately it's a gun like this one that takes away the lives. This is the end result.
Scott is basically saying we could blame all these things, but really what needs to be blamed is this inanimate object, this gun. We gotta blame this AR-15. Well, hey Scott, what about this gun? Or this one? How about this gun? What's to stop you from wanting to create laws against these guns? And to stay consistent with your argument, nothing really. Because let's be honest, deaths caused by people using handguns far outweighs the deaths caused by people using any style rifle. So why wouldn't you want to make all the handguns illegal too?
A lot of people will say, well, if we change the laws, the criminals are still going to get the weapons.
Yep, regardless of any gun law, if a criminal wants a weapon, he'll get one.
I'm not worried about the government saying that I can't carry a gun. I'm gonna carry a gun anyway.
The law only serves to penalize law abiders, not law breakers.
So why should we punish legal gun owners, which I am one of?
Now that is a good question. The answer is that responsible gun owners should not be punished. That's what a law is. It's a command that carries with it the consequence of a penalty if you break it, whether it's a moral law or not. And let's face it, most laws are immoral.
But I'm going to give you a news flash. Until the other day, Nicholas Cruz was a legal gun owner. Stephen Paddock in Las Vegas, killing 58 people, was a legal gun owner until that night.
Let's be gut honest with ourselves here. We actually don't know whether Cruz or Paddock were legal gun owners, let alone if they actually committed these crimes or not. We have no proof. We know what mainstream media and government sources tell us, but we've already established the fact in previous videos that both mainstream media and government agents are prolific liars. And either way, legality or not, it doesn't matter. If a guy wants to commit a crime with a weapon, he'll get a weapon, regardless of the law. Oh, you want a source for that fact? Hashtag Chicago homicides.
And quite frankly, anyone, any legal gun owner, is capable of snapping and committing a horrific crime, even without mental illness.
What world do you live in, Scott? And what the hell kind of people do you hang around? If a person commits a horrific mass murder, you're not talking about a normal person. What Scott's saying here, because he can only really speak for himself, is that he could snap one day and take that firearm and start committing horrible acts of unspeakable violence. So either he doesn't trust himself and is trying to project that instability onto others, or he was paid to make this emotionally based illogical video, or he's sincerely ignorant about what's really going on around him. Scott goes on to ask what in the world he should do with his AR-15. He says if he sells it, he could get $600 to $800, but he sells it and it ends up in the hands of somebody who uses it to shoot up a school. Well, he wouldn't be able to live with that. Since his conscience won't let him do any of that, here's his conclusion regarding this gun.
So, I've decided today I'm going to make sure this weapon will never be able to take a life.
Now, I want you to remember what he says here. He says he's going to make sure that this weapon will never be able to take a life. And we're going to come back to that later. But Scott, I want you to also consider that this weapon, should you choose to destroy it, will also never be able to save a life. Now check out the coup de grace.
I mean, think about it. Is the right to own this weapon more important than someone's life?
Is the right to own this weapon worth more than someone's life? Here is the deceptive foundation of this whole emotionally based argument. Not just Scott's illogical argument, but it's the fuel that feeds the fire of the anti-gun movement, and we can't afford to get sucked into this faulty line of thinking for 1 second. This is an underhanded, highly deceptive, logical fallacy. That is, there's a fatal flaw in the structure of his argument which renders his entire argument invalid. Based on everything else he says in this video and the way we know he thinks, his question, is the right to own this weapon worth more than someone's life, is actually a statement. He's implying your right to own this weapon is not worth more than someone's life. These two concepts of the right to own something as opposed to the value of a person's life tries to get the listener to choose one and let go of the other, or vice versa. If you answer, yeah, my right to own this weapon is worth more than a person's life, then you are a bad person. If you answer, no, my right to own this weapon is not worth more than a person's life, then based on his argumentation and using his logic, this dictates if you want to save a life, you have to give up your rights. And this is called manipulation. The reason for this manipulation is to push a narrative, namely to punish people who haven't committed any crime just because someone else used the same kind of tool that you happen to own to commit their crime. This is not only nonsense, it's immoral to the core. This is a push to create criminals who are not criminals through the force of law. Period.
A weapon like this that can cause so much death and destruction?
Inanimate objects don't cause death and destruction. People cause death and destruction. Guns, cars, and hammers are tools. People choose to use these tools either for good or for evil. Now listen to his dishonest and deceptive juxtaposition of emotion, which mixes murder victims with holding on to individual rights.
I mean, look at the pictures of those victims. Is that right more important? I don't think so.
Again, victims of a horrific murder have nothing to do with yours or my ownership of any kind of weapon. At this point, Scott says this.
I'm going to make sure that will never happen with my weapon.
Now he proceeds to take a chop saw and cut the barrel of his AR-15. And here's the hilariously ironic thing. I want you to pay close attention to a magical moment that's about to take place right here on video before your very eyes. Scott Pappalardo went from a legal firearms owner to, wait for it, right there. Did you see the barrel drop? Scott Pappalardo just became a felon. And he did this while trying to stoke the fires of more gun legislation, while he's breaking the law. Why is he a felon at this moment in the eyes of the state? He makes a cut to the barrel about 3 to 4 inches from the barrel nut. Unless he had a previously approved ATF Form 1 to create an SBR, or short barrel rifle, regardless of intent, he violated the National Firearms Act of 1934, which requires a rifle to have a barrel of at least 16 inches or an overall length of less than 26 inches. Just for an example, here's my stock AR-15 M&P. Its overall length is a little more than 32 inches. If I cut mine about where Scott cut his, the overall length will be cut down to about 19 inches, as indicated on the tape measure by this deadly knife. By the way, the number of people who died in knife crime in 2016 was 1,604, almost 4.5 times that of every style of rifle combined. 374 people were shot to death by rifle in 2016, and the AR-15 makes up a very small portion of that number. Oh, and that hammer right there? 472 died by hammer crime in that same year. Almost 100 more people died by way of assault hammer than by rifle. If you statists are concerned about those deaths, which you haven't been, I'm sure your legislators will be more than willing to make a law for that too. So just to recap, the most deadly weapon in the frame here is that assault-styled steak knife, not the AR-15. Anyway, back to our newly minted felon, Scott Pappalardo.
I can't live knowing that my gun's out there and it can one day possibly commit a horrific act like the other day in Florida.
And this is what I said we'd come back to. He literally said, my gun could possibly commit a horrific act. Remember what he said before?
But ultimately, it's a gun like this one that takes away the lives.
Guns don't commit horrific acts, and guns don't take away lives any more than hammers or knives. People use these instruments and tools to take away lives. And the people that don't use these tools in that fashion should not be punished. End of story. And if they are punished for committing no crime at all, then this is an immoral act based on an unjust law. And when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. Scott ends by saying that he's not saying that this kind of action is for everyone. And he admits that this isn't going to solve the problem and that people will find a way to kill one way or another. But then he says,
but they're not going to do it with this gun.
But they're not going to do it with this gun. In other words, they're not going to kill anybody with this gun. Actually, Scott, somebody could still use that gun in that state to kill somebody. And even if you make another cut into the body of the gun, and somebody finds that gun in your trash can or in the landfill, they could literally take what's left of that gun and beat somebody to death with it. Could you live with that? This is how ridiculous this gets. Scott ends by saying this.
And for all you haters out there that think I'm very stupid for doing this, I hope and I pray that it doesn't take the barrel of one of these guns pointed at your child's head to change your mind.
Why in the world would I disarm myself just because some madman pointed a gun at my kid's head? It would be for that very reason that I would arm myself. And exactly why I wouldn't want to disarm myself. I have other kids and other people in my life. And there are other innocent people like the kids in the school down the street that I could protect using that firearm. Why would I destroy an effective means by which I could keep them safe? So based on what Scott Pappalardo said in this video, he is not a firm believer in the Second Amendment because he believes people's right to bear arms shall be infringed. So he's lying to himself and everybody else on that. Second, I have a question for you, Scott. Now that you've destroyed your AR-15, are you willing to destroy your other weapons? After all, they could also be used to kill kids, and you've already said you can't live with that. Since handguns kill many more people every year than rifles, I expect to see a video of you doing away with your remaining weapons. If you don't, you're nothing but a hypocrite. Third, let's say tomorrow, Scott, you hear on the radio that there's an active shooter killing kids in a school right down the street from you, and you knew that you could arrive way before any other first responder. What are you going to use to protect those kids against a criminal with a firearm? And Scott, I guess my final question to you is this. Is your desire to give up your right to own a gun more important than being able to save a person's life with the gun you just gave up?